Welcome to part 2 of my chat with Alex Lau. We're talking about his excellent book, Keep Calm and Code On. So grab your beverage of choice and come and join us as we discuss the book. I picked out a couple of bits in the book that really resonated to me. Shiny objects. I mean, that's such an obvious one for software engineers, isn't it? We get distracted by so easily.
Yeah, all the time, right? So for those listening out there that haven't read the book, this chapter is The Shiny Objects Pitfall. Basically talks about how, as developers, we're constantly enamored with new technologies, thinking that this new library or this new framework or this new language or whatever is going to be the solution to all of our problems, and kind of just bestowing the benefit of the doubt upon it, regardless of whether it's earned or not. And I think that the argument that I would make is that much of the time, the problem isn't the tool itself that you're using to solve a given problem, but the approach that you're taking or the questions that you're asking yourself or things like that. Whereas it's not about the mechanism that you're using to solve the problem, but it's about whether you've even honed in on the problem itself or not. And the reason I'm so glad that you brought this one up, John, is because any casual reader who's familiar with both of our work would maybe think that we're at odds with each other on this one. And, given that you promote exercises of rewriting code as a way to learn things, I can see how somebody might think oh, that's just having shiny objects and trying to work on that same thing over and again, right?
And in many ways it is. I mean, I was writing earlier, I think I ended up listing about 20 programming languages I've learned over the years. That's totally me being guilty of it. It's oh, hey, that looks fun. I'll go and learn that one.
Yeah.
So I've relearned a lot of these programs that are in my coding challenges many times in different languages over the years. And I've learned those different languages because they were a shiny object. There was something fun, new, and to go and learn, or go and learn a bit of some new technology.
Yeah. I think that there's definitely a bit of judicious decision making that should come along with it. I don't think there's anything wrong with learning new languages and frameworks and programs. And in fact, I encourage it in many ways as a way to kind of broaden your skill set and the way that you think about problems. I think the danger in it is if you're doing it because you think that this new framework will solve all your problems, and that you do it maybe without the appropriate research behind it, or even escape hatch, where it's maybe we'll try this new framework, but if it doesn't work, then we'll go back to the old way of doing it, rather than being we're all in on this new thing that nobody's ever written a single line of code in, right?
Yeah, well, I've totally burnt myself on that early in my career with, hey, we're going to use this new shiny thing. Yeah, learned the hard way that was a mistake.
Yeah.
So now it's, I'm going to try this new shiny thing because it's cool and I want to explore it and I'm going to learn it. But it's going to be in a side project, or it's going to be on a tool that's not on a critical path. And I'm going to do it for the sake of what can I learn? And, maybe there's something new. Maybe I'll learn a different approach. Maybe there's a technique. Maybe there's some idiom that I'll take from this language that can help with this one. So now, as you say, it's more judicious. It's more thoughtful of what are going to be the benefits of that.
Right,
and
exactly.
Is it just to satisfy curiosity and learn? Is it maybe to make you think differently? Because again, if you're used to working in, say, Java, where you're forced to write everything as a class, if you then write in a non-OO language, or maybe you write in a functional language, you learn a completely different style. So it can give you a different approach and a different perspective on it.
Right. Yeah. In many ways, I think of it as this exercise of having a toolkit and kind of building up this toolkit, right? You know when to reach for certain tools that are a good fit for certain problems.
Yeah, that's a good way. And if you've learned multiple tools, you're at least maybe aware that they're available, and you can also be aware of, hey, that's why the one that I'm using, or that's why the one we've got in our project is the right one, and we don't want to rush off after that shiny thing.
Right. Yeah. So and to take the analogy one step further, if you were I don't know. I'm not super handy, so like maybe I shouldn't be talking about tools in that way. But like, I would never embark on a home project where I'm like, okay, I need to like redo this entire room using this tool I've never once used in my life, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You don't rush out and buy a chop saw and then go, right, I've got a chop saw. What
Exactly.
can we do with it? And the other one that really resonated with was this feedback and being right. You know, I talked a little bit earlier at the beginning of the conversation that, you know, I liked the idea that, hey, build the best code. You know, that'll progress. Don't have to deal with people. Clearly, the best code, the best solution will stand on its own legs. Get promoted quickly because I like the best code. Again, that doesn't happen. That being able to give feedback and being able to accept that maybe you're right, but it's not a battle worth having, quite useful.
Yeah,
So that really resonated with me. You know,
that's
is there a
great.
story behind why you picked that one out?
I actually think that that one is maybe one of the ones that's most closely tied to Toastmasters evaluations and kind of this idea of getting feedback. Where I I myself gave a lot of evaluations in my time at Toastmasters, and I saw a lot of other people give evaluations. And the times that I felt kind of like there was a missed opportunity is when either myself or whoever was giving an evaluation had some really good feedback, but they were just like maybe too abrasive about it, or too direct, or too blunt, or they didn't set it up accordingly in a way that was going to make the person receptive to accepting that feedback. And again, it's like, well, sure, you're right, but if you're saying something and you know you're just starting off with this very blunt piece of feedback and the person's never going to be receptive to it or want to use that feedback, like what good is it in the first place? Why'd you even bring it up? Like you've only served to make this person feel uncomfortable, and not only that, they're not going to use this feedback. So it's kind of this lose-lose, right? Whereas I think that there's kind of this art to framing things in a way that somebody's going to be receptive to. And you know, people talk about like the compliment sandwich as a strategy like that, and I don't know if you need to be that direct about it. And I know that there's also kind of like mixed mixed reception to the compliment sandwich in terms of like whether it's effective or not. But I think the underlying thing that I've kind of grown to appreciate is just this idea of empathizing with somebody, like asking questions about why they picked a certain abstraction, for example, kind of like what you talked about earlier, and kind of trying to get in their shoes. And, you know, if I'm a senior and I'm reviewing somebody's, a junior's piece of code, and I ask them why they chose that thing, because secretly I'm thinking like, well, I would have done it differently, but like, let me hear about why you're doing it. And, you know, if it's something that's not a life or death, super drastic consequence, like oftentimes I'm okay with them making that decision and letting them kind of like walk down that path and seeing how it plays out in a couple of months. If it's something that's like, you know, I feel lightly about this, not super strongly, and I would have done it this way, but ultimately, like, this is your decision, and like, I want you to learn from it. I think that there's like this tightrope to walk of like saying, oh no, you should never do it this way because XYZ is like the better way. Like, people aren't going to learn from that. And much of the time, people don't need to be told what to do. They just need to be made aware of like, oh, this is the trade-off that you're making, or like this is like why I differ in my opinion for something. Because at the end of the day, as you and I both know, it's all about making trade-offs for any given solution.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that it's all about making trade-offs. In that we talk about that from a technical point of view. But I've mentioned a few times in some of my posts on LinkedIn that I used to say yes, but quite a lot. And that used to get really annoy somebody I work with.
Mm.
And it meant that they just stopped listening. Now, I've told this story a bit, and that, you know, I was eventually pointed to saying yes and, because they would talk about this great idea, and I'd agree. So I'd say yes. And then I'd go straight into the kind of, but I solve problems, I'm curious. Like, yes, that's a great idea, but and then here's all the challenges we've got to come over. And to my
Sure.
mind, it was like, yes, I'm agreeing with you, but we've got to do these steps. So how do we do it? Let's start solving the problems. That's not what they heard. They heard, yes, but, which to them was, yes, you said something, but it's stupid, and here's all the reasons why it's stupid.
Mhm.
And that wasn't what I meant, but that's what they heard. And it took me longer than I'd really like to admit to realize that that tiny little change of words made a huge difference to them. So when it became, yes, and here are the challenges we need to overcome, that landed completely differently to, yes, but we need to do this, this, and this first.
Right.
And when I write about that, I get about half the responses saying, well, they shouldn't be such a snowflake. They're an idiot. Find better people to work with. And it's a tiny little, it's a three-letter word. It's a trivial example, but it makes a huge difference of how people treat this feedback. So it is quite important we think about that feedback and think about how we give that feedback to people. And as you say, empathize with them and be aware that it's about how they perceive it. And if they perceive your message and your feedback as constructive and useful, they might listen to it. If they perceive it as negative, they're just going to become defensive and they're going to stop listening. And then neither of us wins. We both lose out of that, don't we?
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely, again, it's like kind of a sad state to be in when there is, I mean, I don't want to be sounding cliche, but there is like a true win-win when you give feedback that is somebody like both insightful and somebody is like likely to, if not implement it immediately, at least learn from it and use it in the future. And I would say, huge props to you for even recognizing that. You said it took longer than you wanted, but being able to make that change isn't always easy. And I'm glad that it was like a relatively small one, but that just kind of goes to show you that it doesn't need to be like this huge monumental thing that you shift. It can be sometimes, depending on how you want to, like what thing you're trying to change, right? But it doesn't always have to be. And I think that kind of points to what I was talking about earlier of empathizing with somebody and putting yourself in their shoes of like how they
Yeah,
want
and
to receive feedback.
that's a great point in that it is just a small thing. Most of these things, when we say develop soft skills, develop empathy, it's not like you have to go and change who you are and do something different.
Right.
It can be as small as but to and.
Mm-hmm.
Or instead of saying, I wouldn't do it that way, in a very forceful, I wouldn't do it that way,
Right.
you can change into, oh, I wouldn't have done it that way. Why did you choose to?
Right.
You've said the same thing, but it's just with curiosity and as a question rather than maybe being accusatory.
Yeah.
Cool.
One thing that definitely doesn't help in a lot of code reviews is that I default to just commenting on everything, right? And I think that's how a lot of code reviews operate, where it's like you lose a lot of that tone and context from what somebody, like how somebody's trying to portray something when you're only communicating over text. And sometimes especially for like larger changes and PRs, like I find it to be helpful to do like a video chat kind of review if it's something where it's a huge architectural change, or maybe we've just hit what I call like video velocity, where it's like, okay, we've been talking about this a lot back and forth. Can we just like hop on a call real quick instead and chat through it? Because I'm not sure if I'm interpreting what you're saying correctly, or, there's like clearly some gap here. We're probably better off just chatting through it, because the amount of information that's conveyed through video is so much more than over text.
And again, when you got text, why did you do it that way?
Yeah.
Written in text. Some people hear as, why did you do it that way? You're an
Right.
idiot. Subcontext. Whereas you might have meant it as, oh, why did you do it that way? Genuine cure.
Yes.
They don't get that from you. When it's just text, they don't get that. They'll read it one way or the other. I mean, an extreme example as well. I once got a phone call from my boss a few years back now saying, hey, John, I've just had, we'll call him Bob, to protect the innocent or guilty. Just have Bob on the phone, really upset. How have you offended him? And I was like, I haven't spoken to Bob today. This is strange. It's like, well, have you exchanged any messages with him on like Slack or email? I don't think so. Let me just check. Look back. I've sent one email in response to an email from Bob. My email just said yes. They took a lot of offense at that and phoned up and complained to my boss about it.
Wow.
And it was, again, for me, I've been quite busy rushing around. Their email said, "We're upset about this, blah, 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 blah. One of your team has done something that's wrong. Can we have a meeting about it on Monday?" And I was rushing around dealing with a customer issue at the time.
Yeah.
So I just, yes, hit response. And I'm thinking, yeah, of course we can. My calendar's open, just book a meeting. Didn't really think much of it, but again, they were very upset. I hadn't really put that empathy into thinking, hey, they're really upset about what something one of my engineers had done. They're really bothered by it. They wanted more of a response, and yes, they wanted me to show that I understood that they were upset and that I cared. And again, it's just that empathy, isn't it? And again, it's just, if I just put really solid here, that sure, let's set something up, pick a time in Mocha. Wouldn't have taken me that much longer to write, but would have shown a bit more empathy and would have been far more aware.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's a really interesting example. It's interesting because I feel like when you're reading into the text and like you're kind of playing it back as you're reading it, like as you're mentally playing it back in your mind, like I think that sometimes the way that if I'm reading your message, the way that I would portray that would be kind of based on my interactions with you in the past, the text itself, and then the specific context that we're talking in. And so I think in this case, that context was really important of like, your coworker was very upset about this thing. And so even just to have a short answer didn't acknowledge that the entire backstory behind this email was that they were upset and they were looking to, take some action in the future or whatever. And so like, even just acknowledging their upsetness and anger and stress would have been what made all the difference in the world. But it's interesting that affects how they would just read into literally one single word, right?
well, there was a bit more context. They were having some problems with an illness and the medication they were on and stuff, so they were being a bit more sensitive. So
Sure. Yeah. And all that goes to show that you don't know what any person that you're working with is going through, right? So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, again, fortunately, the pair of us had a good laugh about it afterwards, and
sure.
It actually strengthened our relationship in the end. But again, there was a lesson there for me that that empathy, it's such a small thing that would have made quite a big difference.
Yeah.
To them absolutely. At that time. So another pitfall you highlighted that really stood out for me, because this seems such a common one in software engineering, is reinventing the wheel. Or as you put it, the wheel reinvention pitfall.
Yes.
Again,
yes.
Guilty of this myself. Been there, done that.
Yes. And again, I think for readers that are familiar with both of or viewers who are familiar with both of our work, they might think, oh, you and I, we have like some huge battle to like embark on, because if you're talking about the exercise, if you're promoting exercises where you're like, hey, you should, rewrite this application as a way to learn X, Y, and Z skills. Like I could see how somebody would interpret the pitfall that I'm portraying here as an example of that, when again, I think that that's not the case. So to take a step back and to just explain the pitfall itself, reinventing the wheel is writing your own solution, rolling your own solution, writing your own code for a problem that's already solved. And that problem might already be solved in another module of code that you have, another function, or it might be something as overarching as a library or some built-in helper in the language. And I think, I'm not sure if I talk about this specific example in the book or not, but when I think of this, I think of like the very first like big application that I wrote. I rewrote the linked list class myself and thinking that was just like, this is what programmers do. And looking back on that, I mean, I was so early on in my career, I should probably give myself a little bit of grace, but it seems just absolutely wild to even entertain that thought, right? And in that case, it's very obvious that, there's already this built-in logic in the language itself. And not only is it built in, so it's easier to use and to call, where I don't have to write it, but it's also way more robust, way more efficient. Like it's battle hardened. It's kind of a no-brainer to use it, right? I think where this pitfall really bites people in day-to-day work is, again, when you're kind of thinking that your own solution is, thinking that your product is like maybe more unique, or that some aspect of it needs to be more unique than it is. So if you were trying to like write your own auth system or something like that, like maybe the question you should be asking yourself is like, are our users using our accounting software, whatever it is? Like, are they using it because it does accounting logic really well, or are they using it because we have this amazing auth flow that's like very seamless and fast for them? Like, if the answer is that they don't actually care about, like, this isn't your differentiating factor and the reason people are using your product. And in this case, I mean, there's a million auth libraries and frameworks out there. You probably shouldn't be rolling your own for that as well either. So I think, again, it kind of just boils down to the context that you're in, and kind of weighing the pros and cons of rolling your own versus using an existing solution. The other thing I would say is that, again, I think that the exercises that you're proposing with rewriting things are actually a great way to learn things. Like, the time to embrace reinventing the wheel is when you're trying to learn things, because if you're writing, if I'm sitting down and saying like, oh, I want to make my own new web application and I want to do like X, Y, and Z new features that I don't really see in other web applications, or like I haven't implemented before, there's a lot of overhead and mental work that you put towards exploring how different nuances of a feature should work. And ultimately, I think that if you're trying to just get more familiar with a language or different constructs or things behind it, you're doing yourself a disservice by picking a more fuzzy, nebulous domain to try to work on, because you're getting distracted by having to wear that hat of like product manager and engineer. Whereas if you're working on an exercise where you already have like the problem in front of you and like those feature bits kind of specced out and you know what to expect, like then a lot of those decisions are made for you. You can kind of focus more on the code itself.
Yeah, absolutely. You're totally right. Every couple of weeks, I get a bunch of people comment on coding challenges, say, "Don't do this. Don't build your own Redis. Don't write your own memcache." Like, it's like, use the production one. It's like, yeah, absolutely. In production, you use battle tested, the proven ones that are well tested, that are well supported, and all the other good things that you mentioned about the linked list as well. But if you want to learn how to build a network server, learn how to build a network server by taking one that's got a well-defined protocol, that's proven, that you can use tools to connect to and see how it works, and understand building a network server. Don't try and invent a new network server and figure out how to create a protocol when you don't know any of that. You take an existing one and build a kind of Redis or Memcached or something, and learn from their examples. And once you've learned how to build that server and handle concurrent clients, you learn how to parse their protocol, maybe next time you can go and build your own server and invent your own protocol and stuff. But it gives you those stepping stones, doesn't it, to progress?
Right. Yeah. And I think that one thing I've kind of appreciated as I've kind of grown in my career is that, there's a lot of people that work in the field of software development, and a lot of the problems have already been approached or solved in some way. And like you're saying, it's important to learn those techniques and be aware of them, because there's a lot of times when they will just take care completely of the same challenges that you're trying to solve. But then there's other times where you may want to make this conscious decision to deviate from them. But again, you can't really make that decision without being aware of them in the first place.
Yeah. And one of my favorite challenges that I've done is Docker. And I've used Docker for getting on for a decade now. But I hadn't really understood how it genuinely works, where go away and build your own container runtime. Actually, you understand far better how it works, and you understand far better now.
Right.
So I'm not going to use my own container runtime in production, but having built one, even if it is a fairly toy example, far better understanding of how Docker works now and how Kubernetes works and what you're doing when you're building a container, and far better appreciation of why you might want to do things a certain way and how they're going to impact it. So
Yeah,
it
yeah,
gives that
absolutely.
far deeper understanding as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like, there's no better way, at least the way that I tend to appreciate learning new concepts is by going in and playing around with them and kind of getting my hands dirty, right? And you can't really do that without um, like going through that exercise of seeing the different parts at play and working on that yourself.
Yeah. Well, I like to think of it back to in my childhood. You know, you get a Lego kit, you put it together, that's great, but then pull it apart and see how you can put the pieces together and what else you can make.
Yeah, yeah,
That's
for
that's
sure.
when you really learn from that. That's when you built something amazing and discovered what you could do when you played with it. Cool. I've taken up an hour and a bit of your time now, Alex, so I should let you go. Um, what what final things would you like to share about the book? What's the highlight for you? What's the one thing that you really wish more people had read from it?
Well, I think my favorite chapter of the book is called The Half Measure Pitfall. And the gist of that pitfall and problem is when teams or individuals make this decision to kind of like have one foot on each side of the fence for a transitionary phase for different technology. So, like, I think the example I give is we've got this reporting system in place, but then we have this new reporting system that uses a different framework and library and whatever that's clearly better for the new one. But rather than trying to migrate everything over in one fell swoop, we're going to just let both of these systems live on side by side. Anytime somebody modifies an old report, we'll use that as an opportunity to kind of like judge and gauge whether we should maybe rewrite it in the new reporting system or not. And what I've found is that nearly every time I've done that and taken that approach, which seems very reasonable at first glance, but nearly every time I've done that, what you have is instead of the new reporting system that we're like moving towards and gaining momentum towards, we're just going to live on with two reporting systems forever. Even if everybody agrees that the new one is better from a technical perspective, has more elegant code, is faster, blah, blah, blah. Until you make that decision to kind of like more firmly cut over, you're kind of living this dual life and suffering a bit of a death of 1,000 paper cuts where it's like, oh yeah, I have to switch the context that I'm thinking about when I go to look at this old reporting file. I need to kind of like mentally ramp up again. It's never anything huge, but the combination of having that extra overhead and then having no definitive endpoint is, I think, is what really bites people. And again, I think that there's maybe times when you make a conscious decision of like, hey, we've got so many other things on our plate right now that we're totally fine having two reporting systems live on for the time being. But again, I think that the danger is when you don't do that and you're just like, oh yeah, this seems like a reasonable take. Like, eventually we'll get there, and kind of telling yourself this lie in the meantime without having like a more rigorous, thoughtful plan towards it. So maybe one of the big takeaways from the book, since I've mentioned it in every pitfall that we've talked about, is this idea of making conscious decisions. Like, I want people to think about software critically. And it's one of the things I struggled with is like, we talk about it depends as like the answer for anytime somebody asks you a technical question, because there's just so much context and nuance that come along with answering anything. And one of the things I struggled with the book on is like, well, how do I give people a rule of thumb if there's always going to be an exception to it, right? Like, if anybody's going to be able to pull a single chapter and be like, actually, there's this example that is a counterpoint to this. And yes, of course there is, right? There's always going to be that. And I think that the approach that I take is, again, to inform readers of like, this is the problem and this is like why it's a problem. And I think if readers are able to kind of like figure out that underlying why, hopefully along with the example that I give and like the definition that I give, they'll be able to kind of form their own judgments about when a proposed solution that I'm giving is appropriate. And I think that that's like the ultimate goal behind it all. It isn't that people will avoid every single mistake that I've outlined, because not only is that not feasible, but again, it may be like, it maybe robs them of some experience of walking that path themselves. But if I could go back and like talk to my younger self, of course I would want to warn myself of these potential pitfalls and like obstacles that I could encounter, because I think having that context is immensely useful, because it gives you a little bit more critical thinking behind how you approach it.
Yeah, that's very true. That context is so important, and on it depends. It depends is not a useful answer. It
Right.
needs to be it depends upon, and it needs to be it depends plus that context of what it depends on and why and how you do that. So, I think too many software engineers maybe early in their career stop with it depends, and it has to have a bit more. Kind of reminded me there as you're talking about you also mentioned a default to yes pitfall. I think a lot of us need to learn to say no more often and say, no, we're
Yes.
not doing it, or it's time to stop. Cool. So for those watching the video, Alex's book is Keep Calm and Code On. Where can they find it, Alex?
You can find it on the book's website, keepcalmandcodeon.com, or if you just search for Keep Calm and Code On book on Amazon, you'll find it there as well.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you very much for your time, Alex.
Yeah, thank you for having me, John.